Greetings and welcome. I'm Ken Wheeler, professor of history at Reinhardt University. Thank you all for being here today. We're excited about what we're doing this morning, and what we're going to have a talk from Dr. Jennifer Lund Smith, and then we're going to take a little break, and you can refill coffee cups and everything. There are restrooms just out here and to the right. And then we'll reconvene for after 5 or so minutes or so, and we'll reconvene and have sort of a panel discussion that launches off from the talk, but I think will take us in a variety of directions, and we'll also welcome comments and discussion from the members of the audience. Our speaker this morning, Jennifer Smith, she comes to us from Dahlonega, where she is Associate Professor of History at what is now the University of North Georgia, but was, a short time ago, North Georgia College and State University. So you know that the university system in Georgia is merging and combining and changing names, so she's caught up in that, but she knows who she is, and I know her as a good friend and one who is very respected in and around the state. She has just completed her term as president of the Georgia Association of Historians. We met this last February on St. Simon's Island, and it was just a wonderful gathering of people who study history from around the state and even further. And so we appreciate her leadership of that statewide organization. Dr. Smith's dissertation comes from the University of Georgia, and she is an expert in the development of education in post-Civil War Georgia. We welcome her for her talk. Dr. Smith.
Good morning, and I'm honored to be here, and especially to talk to you brave people who came out very early on a Saturday morning that isn't so pleasant, so thank you for being here. Ken introduced me as an expert of the beginnings of education, but more specifically, I've looked at the beginnings of African American education, and what has really intrigued me since graduate school is the transition, how the transition, how do people go from slavery to freedom? And well, one of the things was they'd been planning for it for a long time and hoping for it, but what were the actual steps that were taken, and how well did it work in a lot of different places? So I have looked at the way it has worked out in various places in Georgia. My paper today is going to focus on the northern parts of Georgia, and eventually particularly in Dahlonega, Georgia, because that's where I found a lot of sources. So one of the things that two of the things that I will be arguing today was that it was much harder for African Americans in North Georgia to start up educational programs because there were so few of them. And my other point is that often they had to use different techniques than other people did where there was a larger number of African Americans in the state. So, historians have long noted that when the Confederates lost the war, making the Emancipation Proclamation law in the former slave states, freed people eagerly hastened to attain an education. although many antebellum free blacks and slaves had defied Southern laws to sneak, pry, and grab an education any way they could and from all sources available, the rebel loss made their desire to learn a lawful goal. Sorry to press the whole Confederate loss thing, but I am a damn Yankee, so. Okay. Still, the available of teachers and resources differed among regions in the South. The areas that contained the high concentrations of freed people in those areas, missionary groups, mostly from the North, moved in immediately after the war to establish schools for the former slaves. In Georgia, the American Missionary Association, which was associated with the Congregationalist Church in the North, they in particular moved swiftly to organize schools in cities such as Savannah, Augusta, Atlanta, and as well as along the Georgia coast. And one of the ways they were able to do that was even before the war had ended, once the United States Navy had taken control of the eastern seaboard, they had established experimentary farming and schooling on people on the Sea Islands. And the American Missionary Association had been involved in that, so they were poised in a position to be able to move further into the South quickly. So in the northern Piedmont, however, in the foothills and the mountains of North Georgia, the antebellum population of slaves and free blacks had remained much smaller than that in southern Georgia. As a result, northern missionary groups did not target the area in the north in large numbers. Freed people in the northernmost part of Georgia had to work harder to initiate schools for their children. Occasionally, a benevolent group sent some money or a teacher their way, but trained educators with ties to funding did not simply appear in their neighborhoods. Freed people throughout northern Georgia, though, did have their own agendas and priorities when it came to their children's educations. The smaller population of black Americans in the mountains meant they had to maintain a delicate balance to avoid arousing the anxieties of their white neighbors. They likewise did not have the luxury and the ability to confront white authorities and northern missionary groups over whether black or white teachers would be given positions in city-sponsored educational schools. And that did happen in Savannah, where there was a large black population. In that city, the black teachers kind of fought for their right to contain black teachers. And one of the reasons for that was they knew that the missionary groups, the white missionary groups, would try to teach northern views, and they were very, how do I put this? They were very patriarchal towards it and didn't exactly see the blacks as equal. And so black people wanted to give their children an education that involved pride in their backgrounds and in their heritage, and it's also pride in themselves. So in North Georgia, African Americans used the means available to them in an attempt to ensure an education for children. Now, my paper is mostly going to focus on education in Lumpkin County, partly because there's a lot of sources there. And they had a way that they particularly used to fight for education with the help of white people in the county. However, I want to start with a brief description of some of the other schools established in the northern counties of Georgia, just to give some context as to why I think Lumpkin County was a little bit unique. As educational opportunities varied around the state, so too did they differ in the counties of northern Georgia. Floyd County in northwest Georgia seems to have mustered the most stable schools in the earliest years of Reconstruction. The antebellum population of that county had included a relatively large number of slaves who became freed people in 1865. Also, that county served as a hub of a sub-district of the Freedmen's Bureau. So it may have received more attention from the residing bureau agent as a result. But in March 1867, William Thompson, an African American, taught the earliest school in Rome. The Daughters of Zion, associated with the African Methodist Episcopal Church, sponsored this school, and that was a self-help group. They often, I don't think that they did in Rome, but in other places they established bank accounts that they were gathering monies to help freed people in need, and they seem to have helped pay the salary of the teacher there. 140 children attended the school despite what they called, quote, the most contemptible disapproval of the whites. There was also a related Sabbath school led by 20 African American teachers, and there were a lot of Sabbath schools, some we don't know about, but these schools seem to have reached more people than even these academic schools that were established for freed people, and they seem to exist almost everywhere. So that they probably served more students than even the 140 who were getting an education in Floyd County through that school by William Thompson. In May 1867, E.L. Eberhardt, who was the superintendent of the Freedmen's Bureau at the time, sent around a circular in response to inquiries from those who were hoping to get assistance from the Freedmen's Bureau that year. Eberhardt's circular stated that although he could not dispense additional assistance at the time, he encouraged the freedmen to, quote, organize educational associations, appoint school committees, collect money, secure land upon which to erect a schoolhouse, take steps to put the schoolhouses in their possession and in good condition, and to do whatever seems necessary for opening the schools in October, which was a pretty high charge for people who, as Ken was mentioning yesterday, the destitution of the South after the Civil War for all people, and then imagine these freed people who really didn't have anything to be able to do and fill these requirements would have been amazing that they could do that. And then he said, you know, if you have your schoolhouse and you're prepared to pay a portion of the expenses from the school, then in all probability, they would receive sufficient and secure good and efficient teachers. So that was what was held out in front of them. So in the fall of 1867, several months after that circular went out, perhaps in reaction to the circular, two new groups had formed to support education in Floyd County. One was an unnamed Freedmen's Aid Society, which may have been the freedmen themselves, and also a Rome Educational Society, which I don't know anything about. But they had joined the Sisters of Zion in supporting schools in the area, and by then there were 3 schools that were operating. And one of them was by the early years, the early months of 1867, was a smaller school that was called the Chubb School, which I'll come back to in a little bit, existed in Cave Springs on the southern border of the county. serving 36 students and a seemingly poorer population. That school too, created a great deal of, quote, bitterness in the neighborhood from white citizens. Moreover, a white teacher from Ohio, J.B. Forster, in 1868, had arrived to help with the school in Rome, supported by another unnamed benevolent society in Ohio. So they did get some northern support. I think they were paying his salary. So while William Thompson, the original school teacher, had asked for another teacher to help with his large class of 140 students, it would be interesting to know about the dynamics that ensued between this white northern teacher and the black indigenous southern teacher. Unfortunately, alas, that information is unrecorded. Outside of Floyd County, in the years right after the war, other schools existed in Dalton and in Ringgold, and several smaller schools in Forsyth County. In early 1868, a man named Henry Daniels, who was also an African-American teacher, taught a school in Canton. And I don't know very much about that school, but I'd like to, knowing the educational efforts that I heard about yesterday. But it did appear in the Freedmen's Bureau, the teachers would send reports to the Freedmen's Bureau, and for several months there was reports coming from a school in Canton. But in Canton, by the fall, a white teacher had replaced him. But the parents in Canton also, those 30 students, their parents managed to pay the salary of this teacher. So somewhere they were finding money up here. Those schools did better than the school in Cartersville, from which the teacher, F.J. Norris, warned the Freedmen's Bureau in November of 1867 that his school building, which was a small log cabin, was in such a, quote, open condition that it would soon become impossible to teach. And indeed, in January, 2 months later, the district superintendent's report noted that the school no longer existed because wind had blown down their school. So a lot of these buildings that they were setting up schoolhouses were barely stable. They often talked about the drafty situations and how hard it was to keep it warm in the winter months, and often they were windowless and very poor conditions. Further east, M.R. Archer, the agent for the Freedmen's Bureau in Lumpkin County, and he was in Dahlonega, noted that 2 schools lay in his district in the group in the month of 1867. There was one in White County and one in Dahlonega. He noted that the Freedmen had built a log house in Cleveland. But oddly, that school never sent any records to the Freedmen's Bureau. And I was kind of expecting that they would, because their gold, I was trying to tie this to gold, and they had sizable gold mining efforts in White County, but I haven't been able to find what happened to that school. But I did find, looking through some of the census records, that it's possible, I can't prove it, that a man named Elias Earl, and maybe also another man named Edward Brown, who did teach schools for black children in White County after 1874, when White County had actually established public schools. There were 2 schools for African Americans, and those were the teachers there. I can't prove it. One of the things that I found very interesting as I was looking in the census data for Elias Earl to try to find out where he had been in 1870 and 1880. And it did say that he was from South Carolina. And the wonderful thing about doing this kind of micro research now is that the census records are online. And so if you type in somebody's name like Elias Earl, it can be frustrating. Sometimes you can find 20. But Elias Earl isn't that common a name, again. And he'd been born in South Carolina. So there was an Elias Earl in South Carolina. And so I checked on that. And he was a large planter, white, whereas this Elias Earl was listed as a black man. But I went through the 60 slave census records, and the Elias Earl in South Carolina did have a slave of the same age, a male slave, that Elias Earl would have been at that time. And I can't prove this at all, but I like to think, I mean, it's kind of interesting to think that this may be the same Elias Earl. He was sold to Georgia, and he took his master's, old master's name, almost took his identity in a sense. I think that's extremely ironic and clever, and a way to kind of get back at his master. I think it's fantastic. But somehow they did find a means to pay for a school, but again, I didn't find anything in the Freedmen's Bureau records about that school. A possibility is that it was a Sabbath school only, and the people who taught it didn't have the knowledge of how to actually get the Freedmen's Bureau to help, how that mechanism would work, or they just didn't bother to contact the Freedmen's Bureau. So there was one there. It kind of disappeared, and that happens with a lot of these schools. In April of 1867, a man whose name I think is Burnside, but I was reading a lot of sloppy penmanship with ink pens from the 60s, but he was a bureau a bureau agent in Lumpkin County, reported to the superintendents of schools for the Freedmen's Bureau that Dahlonega had only one day school with 5 scholars, very small, taught by a black woman at her residence, and also a Sunday school taught by black teachers that was attended by about 40 scholars. One of the things, just on another side, that happened after the war was eager were the freed people to get any kind of schooling that African Americans who had somehow found a way, the estimates are about, historians estimate about 5 to 10 African Americans could read before the Civil War. But whatever they knew, whatever information they had, they set up a school and started teaching other people what they knew to try to disseminate that information. As many scholars have noted that by the end of the century, African American teachers tended to be those who had arisen to become the black elite. And one of the reasons that they focused on education was that they wanted to encourage the uplift of the race, which would make all African Americans more acceptable and hopefully assimilable. I don't think that's a word, but they could assimilate into American society. But at the very beginning, it was, we want an education. We know that's important. They didn't let us have it, so we know it's important. So there were a lot of these teachers who were teaching people what they knew. So there was a very small effort in April of 1867 in Lumpkin County, but 6 months later, educational services had expanded. In the fall, a Baptist minister named W.J. Wooten sent a report to the Freedmen's Bureau stating that he had begun teaching a school of 115 pupils under the name of the Dahlonega Education Society. He also mentioned an active Sabbath school taught by one white teacher, which presumably was him, and 5 other black teachers. The impetus for school, and the one that Wooten had established in Lumpkin County, came from parents. Black miners in Dahlonega had turned to the superintendent of a mine. And in Lumpkin County, as you probably know, they discovered gold there and began opening numerous mines. Like you said yesterday, Ken, there were a lot of very small ones. There were some that were bigger, but hundreds of mines in Lumpkin County. And one of the ways to provide labor for these mines, which was backbreaking work, were slaves. And a lot of slaves were brought to Lumpkin County. They were lent out to the mining companies. Their masters would get the wages, but they worked in these mining companies. And John Calhoun, who was once the vice president of the United States and the one who kind of tried to create the Nullification Convention, if you're familiar with that, so that South Carolina wouldn't have to pay the northern taxes, essentially. He had a huge mine, a very productive mine, and he also used his slaves in those mines when they weren't needed on the plantation. So there were black people working in the mines both before and after the war. The mines in Dahlonega were admittedly smaller after the Civil War. The California gold rush had taken a toll on their workforce, but they were still operating. So these black men who were working in mines that still existed turned to Amory Dexter, the superintendent of the Dahlonega Mining Company, as an advocate to help them establish a school. And so, acting on the appeal of these black parents, Dexter contacted W.J. Wooten, who was a Baptist minister, who did help establish the Sabbath school, so he knew he was doing that, and he asked him, would you be willing to actually establish another school with larger curriculum? It may have been Dexter, and it may have been the African-American parents, it may have been both, who learned about Eberhardt's circular, which asked African-Americans to put everything in place before they could get assistance from the Freedmen's Bureau. They probably heard about that circular that all but promised to provide economic assistance to schools in the fall. So perhaps with this information, Dexter managed to entice Wooten to take on the task of establishing and maintaining a day school. Both Dexter and Wooten worked hard to solicit funds. Dexter contacted what he called Friends in the North, and he was a Northerner who had come down south and fought for the Confederacy. And Wooten began a steady stream of letters to the Freedmen's Bureau. By the summer of 1867, Wooten totaled his students at 80. Dexter's northern contacts sent a box of books and $300, but that didn't go very far, and they ran out of money very quickly. So it wasn't enough to allow the students to attend the schools for free, which is what they wanted to happen. So to cover his expenses, Wooten tried to charge his male students a tuition of $1 a month, and the females 50 cents a month, which I think is a little interesting. I don't know if they felt that they didn't give more education or as much education to the women as they did the men. if the woman couldn't absorb the education. I'm just not sure which, but it was an interesting difference. But nevertheless, the students found coming up with that money, and their parents had a lot of difficulty. So Wooten doubled his pleads to the Freedmen's Bureau for aid, and there were so many letters from him. Really, it was kind of unusual. Now, that a building, and this was one of the things that they did have at this point, so they had their Freedmen's Aid Association that had been established according to the circular, and in Dahlonega, they actually had a building, and this building existed to house a school for the freed people from a very unusual endowment that was made by a white carpenter in Dahlonega named Alexander Duncan. During the antebellum period, Black Baptists in Dahlonega worshipped and had their membership with the white-controlled Dahlonega Baptist Church. See, I'm going to get gold, religion, education, all in here too. Yeah. So in 1852, Duncan deeded a piece of land to the Black Baptists so they could build their own church, the African Baptist Church, which is very interesting. The deed did stipulate, as it did everywhere if there was an independent church, that a white person had to be there to monitor their services so they couldn't be plotting some sort of rebellion, and that they had to take control of building the church building, which they did. The property and the church they built allowed them to worship in their own manner and with a black minister. After Emancipation, the members of the African Baptist Church hastened to separate themselves from the white-controlled Baptist Church. And along with getting an education, one thing that was almost universal was that the freed people immediately left the white churches who had taught them mostly how to obey your master and tied that into obedience to God, to find churches that were more meaningful to them. So they engaged that in first. At first, though, when they tried to leave the church, the white members of the Dahlonega Baptist Church objecting to losing another means of control over these newly freed people, refused to release their letters of transfer, which is kind of quaint. I know that still today, when you move from church to church, there is typically a letter of transfer that will show that you are officially part of a church, but I can't imagine a group of people waiting for that today, so things have changed a little bit. So Daniel Keith, who would become the postbellum preacher for the Dahlonega Baptist Church, sought assistance from William Price, a prominent lawyer, politician, and member of the Dahlonega Baptist Church, to help them with their predicament. And just as a side, Price was also the man who founded North Georgia College. Keith's actions essentially allowed him and Price to engage in the ritual of a black man deferring to a paternalistic white man, a ritual to which white Southerners had become accustomed. In this way, Keith managed to maneuver Price to arrange for the release of the transfers. Now, there was actually, this was a successful bid, but there was another way that part of the church wanted to do that, and that was to go immediately to the Freedmen's Bureau and complain about it. But Keith said, wait a second, let's do this so that our relationship with these white people will remain calm, civil, because in Lumpkin County there weren't that many black people. There were definitely more white people there to worry about. So he appealed to that paternalism of William Price. But he did that on purpose, I believe. After the war, the African American community turned to the church they had built as a church to use it as a schoolhouse, despite its very dilapidated condition. Alexander Duncan, however, at that point, decided he wanted his land back, the land he had deeded to them in trust in 1852. Duncan argued that the congregation had abandoned the church during the war, which kind of makes sense when you think about it, but he said that this therefore meant that they had defaulted on the stipulations of the deed of trust. Excuse me. The free people were unwilling to accept Duncan's claims, so the members of the African Baptist Church chose to take their case to the courts. Now, the actual reasons that Duncan chose to deed this property to the Baptist slaves at the time remain unstated. But a closer look at his private life sheds some clues on his decision. Before the war, Alexander Duncan was in a relationship with a free black woman named Hannah Grant. She held a membership in the Black Baptist Church, as did her brother. Her brother was named James Beauclair, and I'm mentioning him just to talk about the connection of relationships that existed in Lumpkin County. James Beauclair is in legend. It's not completely legend. He did exist, but he's known as Free Jim. That's what people called him, and he's become part of the mining lore of Lumpkin County and Dahlonega for having become a relatively wealthy entrepreneur, landowner, and miner. Under the auspices of a guardian, which a free man had to do to own property, he was able to own a dry goods store, and the Free Jim mine. He owned a mine there. He had found a vein, and he said, "I want to buy this." And so his guardian to help him accomplish this was J.J. Singleton, who was a politician, a fellow miner, and the first superintendent of the United States Mint in Dahlonega. So if he was ready to sponsor him as a guardian, he must have been well trusted, and he must have had some standing in Dahlonega as a free black man. Because Jim had some powerful connections there. And in my vision, historians have to often use their historical imagination to make this come alive. And for some reason, as I was writing this, I kind of confronted my assumption that because he had a lot of respect in Lumpkin County, my vision of him, the way I had this picture of him, I think was a little bit more like Bad Leroy Brown or something, this big man who could make things happen. But I don't know what he looked like. He might have been a tiny little man. I just don't know. But he had the skills to be able to become a very well-respected entrepreneur. One of the things that he did do also was to own a liquor store for a while. And so that did get him kicked out of the Baptist church for about a year. He got back in. But I suspect he was doing more than selling the liquor, too. And he had, again, Free Jim had a relatively comfortable life, as anybody could in Dahlonega when it was, still a pretty rough place to live. But in 1850, once California, now the rush started before then, but he left in 1850 because in 1850, California had become a free state, and it had gold. So he left everything he had and moved out to California to be a free, completely free gold miner. It didn't work out for him, though. He got in a fight with an adversary, and that person shot him, and that was the end of it. But while he was in Dahlonega, he was important. Despite the fact that Duncan and Hannah Grant probably, most likely, had 2 children together, the relationship fell apart sometime during the war. Duncan's will allowed for 2 women, a Mary Ann and a Martha Duncan, to live on a piece of land adjacent to that former church property for as long as they wanted to. And it's most likely that they were his daughters. Mary Ann Duncan was Free James Beauclerc's heir. So it seems like there's a family connection there, and that she was the one who... So they were almost certainly his daughters. Now, whether the end of Duncan's personal relationship with Hannah Grant, whether it was the effects of the war years and the economic difficulties, or maybe it was that Emancipation itself influenced his decision to try to recover the land, is unknown. But he did attempt to take back that land that they were counting on for a schoolhouse. Friedman's education in Dahlonega benefited from Armory Dexter, the mining superintendent, and the fact that he was there, and his northern connections, as well as his position to the Dahlonega Mining Company. It also benefited from the Freedmen's Bureau. They did seem, because there was a Freedmen's Bureau agent in Dahlonega, he did seem to take up their cause and write a lot of letters to the superintendent on their behalf. And it benefited from the tireless and really tireless work that Wooten, the minister, put into that schoolhouse, as well as the freed people themselves. There were a lot of things that came together there in Dahlonega to make it happen. Dexter took it upon himself to write to the superintendent, Eberhardt, at the time again, himself, positing that to keep the Dahlonega school functioning, it would only cost $45 a month to pay the rent on the building, and Wooten was having to pay the rent to be on that property while the court was disputing whether or not the freed people owned it or where Dexter did. So they were paying $9 a month for that. And to provide lights for the school. So, and that wasn't electric lights, of course, but, and that was an incredibly reasonable price. I've seen the costs for other freedmen's school across the country, and they could be $75, $65. That was a very reasonable price. Dexter's vision, the mining superintendent, involved building a new building to replace the small windowless church building that housed the almost 60 students. And it was about 25 by 30 feet. It was pretty small. What Dexter wanted to do, hopefully, was to build a new building on the land on which the abandoned mint stood. Dexter also encouraged the local community to create a board of education for the county to include both white and black students. As a white person, he could sort of throw those ideas out. Whether he appealed to the black and white members of the community is unclear, but he did suggest caution in bringing the ideas to the white population. And as in the other schools that had mentioned that there was some bitterness and objections to establishing a school for freed people there, I think he was worried about that in Dahlonega and Lumpkin County as well, because he did mention that, you know, the white people far outnumber the black people, so we have to be really careful when we do that. So he came up with this great idea, but then he got a new job, a new business adventure, and he left the county for good. So he was not there to kind of see that out. So once Dexter left, it was Wooten, the Baptist minister, who carried the sole responsibility of the school. He seems to have taken a genuine interest in the freed people. Now, after the war, it was really hard to make money, and people were scrambling. And what the teaching did was going to give him a job. So, you know, there was something in it for him too, but he really seems to have taken an interest and tried to work for them very hard. One of his friends who knew him described him as, quote, zealous in his work, and having suffered ostracism, quote, from former friends for such zeal. He was also the minister of the Baptist Church in Dahlonega, so he wasn't completely ostracized, but I'm sure it did get a lot of questioning about why he was actually doing this. And he continued doing it when he wasn't even making any money. In August of 1867, he raised only $16, which wasn't going to cover the needs of the school, let alone his salary. And despite Eberhardt's optimism for the autumn term, that everybody would probably get assistance, that didn't happen. Wooten learned in September that the Freedmen's Bureau could not aid them for the fall. So he kept teaching, but by February, his students owed $200 in back tuition. And Wooten and his wife had just had another baby they were going to have to support. Nevertheless, he did in 1869 say that he was going to go ahead and he was going to start the February term, and he was ready going to do that. So he was hoping that the Freedmen's Bureau was going to assist them if he just told them how awful things were. The poor condition of the schoolhouse served as a constant worry for Wooten. During the war, the building had been stripped, and the drafts that blew through the buildings made it unbearably cold. As winter approached, despite his determination to begin the new session, he told the Freedmen's Bureau agents that he would have to, quote, make other arrangements about a schoolroom or suspend the school altogether. To complicate matters, the court had not yet settled the lawsuit between the church members' claim to the property that Dexter was controlling. To combat losing the land, the church community again turned to William Price, the lawyer. With his help, the freed people won the court decision over the property deeded to them by Alexander Duncan, a victory. But to pay William Price, who had asked a fee of $50, which was substantial, a lien had been placed on that property to ensure payment. So that meant the freed people who couldn't raise money for education, if they wanted to keep that land, they would now have to come up with $50 to keep the land that they felt had been deeded to them and the schoolhouse they had built. In attempt to keep the land, the freed people concentrated their pecuniary attention on paying the lawyer's claim on the land. They had, however, only been able to raise $5 to that end. But their choice demonstrates how much the land meant to them. Economically, they had chosen the land over paying for education. And I think that's kind of important. We assume that education was the absolute most important thing, but for a lot of former slaves, land was important. This was collective land, to be sure, but it was very symbolic to have that. And they probably also gambled that somehow the school was going to keep going because Wooten had been doing that. So they weren't completely abandoning education, but the land was paramount. The freed people's situation in Dahlonega began to worsen in 1868 and 1869. Many of the mining ventures failed during those years, leaving many Lumpkin Countyans, black and white, out of jobs. Wooten explained to the Freedmen's Bureau that the layoffs had forced many men to, quote, go to work for the railroad, which I think was probably in Gainesville. By the next year, he described the needs of the freed people as alarming. They were really, really destitute. While focusing their assets on the church land, the freed people gambled that the Freedmen's Bureau would offer assistance for their children, for their education. In 1868, the Bureau did begin allocating money to the school, paying $25 towards Wooten's salary and paying $5 a month towards the $9 rent. It cost Wooten to rent the dilapidated building. And then also, the Freedmen's Bureau did come through and it engaged a benevolent society in Pittsburgh, it's again unknown, to cover the rest. So the school finally did get some assistance by 1969. But by 1969, because of problems that had existed, economic problems, attendance in Wooten's school had fallen to 30 students, and he had almost given up on Lumpkin County. Other schools had opened in other parts of the county, which might have drawn some students away. In a newspaper article, in an interview that was given in 1949 by a woman named Amanda Green, who had been a slave as a child, she recalled that when she was young, she had attended a school in Cavender Creek, which is in kind of the northeast part of the country, one of the voting districts. And then another teacher taught in, quote, an old log house with a big fireplace in it by a male teacher she didn't particularly care for. And then moreover, 3 additional Sabbath schools existed in Lumpkin County at that time, taught by no less than 24 teachers. Unfortunately, again, little information exists about these Sabbath schools that reached so many people. Just as he was about to abandon the school, in fact, Wooten found what he thought would be the perfect place for his school, which Dexter had kind of thought about, the U.S. Mint. Federal troops had all but abandoned the place by the spring of 1869, leaving it vacant. So actually they did, for a brief time, move into that U.S. Mint, which very shortly after would become North Georgia College. But the building was actually slated, nobody really knew what to do with it, so the building was slated to be auctioned off in 1870. They had a short stay because they didn't get a bidder, but eventually they did, and it was Price. So they had to leave. So William Price was someone who helped, but wasn't going to offer a free ride to those slaves. The Freedmen's Bureau finally, they had sent the money for his salary, a little bit for rent, but they finally offered to build a building for Wooten and his students if they could find a piece of land. And again, it was William Price with whom they negotiated. And I think they were being very clever to continue to negotiate with him, although he wasn't a complete ally, but to allow that situation that deferent situation to exist so that it didn't cause acrimony in Lumpkin County. So Prince, in February of 1870, offered a piece of land just east of town known as Crane's Hill. I understand it's where the Wachovia Bank is now. although they're not in Wachovia anymore, but anyway. Priests deeded the property to 3 African Americans in the county. He charged them, interestingly, to use the land for the education of children, black and white. By what he really meant was black children. The arrangement suited Price quite well. He had just been elected to the U.S. Congress, and he hoped to establish a college on the grounds of the former mint. Price deeded the property to Daniel Keith, who was that first postbellum pastor of the African Baptist Church. And he was also a successful farmer, and by successful farmer for a black man in Lumpkin County, I'm talking that he owned about $200 worth of property, but he was also a mulatto, and so was another man who was on the deed as well. His name was Henry Castleberry, who also owned land contiguous to Keith, and I think these were probably the most successful black men in the county. The other man, who's Thomas Samuels, I haven't been able to find anything about him. So he did not show up on any of the property records. He wasn't wealthy. I wish I knew. So Price's offer was not entirely benevolent. It did cost the freed people the $50 they owed him, and the costly, much more costly promise that they would never make any claim to or seek to enter any colored pupils in the event that the mint did become a college. So they would have their school just outside of town, but African American students were never going to be allowed to attend North Georgia College. That doesn't show up in the books of history, those wonderful history books of North Georgia College. So they did get a school built. The Freedmen's Bureau allocated them about $900 to build a school, which was pretty generous. Wooten was probably the first teacher to teach in the new building when it was built. But by 1875, he had left the country to become a coal porter for the American Tract Society. So he'd become a traveling salesman, essentially, selling the tracts that they sold. Amanda Green, who was the woman who gave the interview in 1949 to the Gainesville paper, also remembered that when she was young, a woman taught in that school. So it may have been this woman named Cora Harris who actually started teaching in the school, but she probably taught only because she needed the money. During the war, she had married a Yankee, and she discovered too late that he was already married. So that damn Yankee left her alone in the South with their daughter to fend for themselves. And by the way, if anybody's familiar with the Cora Harris book, The Circuit Writer's Wife, that wasn't her. In 1871, the state of Georgia created a state board of education, and the Bureau was winding down its work, the Freedmen's Bureau, in most parts of the South. Between 1870 and 1886, the number of schools for black people in Dahlonega vacillated between 2 and 4, and then remained at 4 until the late 19th century. In 1875, the percentage of illiterate children in Lumpkin County was 24%, while the rate for white children was 14%. Although historians have pointed out that that may have been more close to equal than in other places where there was, because Lumpkin County was so poor that the white children weren't really getting a very good education either. So that looks very dramatic, but it was probably a larger gap in other counties. While the educational stories and struggles of other counties in the northern outposts of Georgia during Reconstruction may someday be brought to light, current research shows that Dahlonega, as a result of its proximity to the troops that occupied the Mint right after the war, mining companies that employed freemen after the war, and that one executive, Dexter, who lent his services to support the education of freed people, as well as the indefatigable work of Wooten, was able to keep the school in town open despite their sparse resources. So it took a lot of contingencies to make a school work up here in the North Georgia mountains. The African Americans in Lumpkin County made decisions and compromises regarding the desires to own collective land and their ability to obtain an education for their children. While they did indeed make compromises, they did so on their own terms. Thank you very much.